My aunt said, "You manipulated Grandma and Grandpa into leaving you the house," then demanded I sign it over the week after their funeral, so I replied, "Funny, I was the only one who stayed when everyone else disappeared." 3 days after I buried my grandparents, my aunt showed up at the house with a folder, a notary, and the kind of smile people wear when they think they already won. She did not come to check on me. She came to get my signature on a quitclaim deed, and she acted like I was being difficult by not handing over the only home I had left. The house was still full of funeral flowers, cold casseroles, and the smell of people pretending to care. My grandmother had died first. Then my grandfather had followed her 6 weeks later like his body had decided there was no point trying anymore. I had spent those 6 weeks sleeping in a recliner beside his hospital bed, feeding him crushed ice, changing the bandage on his leg, and making sure he took his medicine even when he got angry and wanted to rip the oxygen tube off his face. My aunt, my uncle, and my 2 cousins had managed exactly 3 visits during that time. All 3 visits were short, awkward, and somehow centered on money. So when my aunt stood in the hallway and told me the house had to stay in the family, I almost laughed from exhaustion. The part that made my stomach turn was not that she wanted the house. It was that she acted like my grandparents had not chosen me on purpose. My name was on the will. The deed transfer had already been prepared through their lawyer. Everything had been handled legally, cleanly, and months before either of them died. But that did not matter to her. She kept saying I must have influenced them, like a 29-year-old woman with a retail job and a pile of medical bills somehow hypnotized 2 stubborn old people into rewriting their entire estate. I did not answer her right away. I was too busy staring at the notary standing in my grandfather's entryway like he had wandered into the wrong disaster. My uncle said he knew it looked bad. That was his first mistake. People only say that when they know it looks terrible and they are hoping you will feel guilty enough to help them bury it. I told them I was not signing anything. Then I closed the front door in their faces and sat down on the kitchen floor because my legs had stopped working. That should have been the end of it. It was not even close. My grandparents had raised me more than my own mother did. My mom died when I was 13, and my dad disappeared into the kind of silence some men call coping until it becomes a personality. After that, my grandparents became the center of my life. They were not soft people. They were practical people. They believed in keeping receipts, fixing things before they broke, and saying what needed to be said instead of pretending every problem would sort itself out. They also had the one thing my other relatives never understood. They had patience. When I lost my apartment at 27 because my landlord sold the building and my roommate moved in with her boyfriend, my grandparents told me to stay in the upstairs bedroom until I got back on my feet. I was supposed to stay a few months. Then my grandmother had a stroke. Then my grandfather started forgetting things that scared him. Then one of them needed help every day, and I stopped counting the months. The house had always been the family base. Holidays, birthdays, and random Sunday dinners all happened there. Everyone loved the house. In the abstract way, people love old things they do not have to maintain. Nobody loved it enough to replace a pipe, mow the back lot, or sit through an 8-hour emergency room wait because Grandma thought her chest was tight again. That was my job. I took the calls. I drove them to appointments. I argued with insurance. I learned which pharmacy was open late. I learned how to calm my grandfather down when he forgot what year it was and got angry at himself for it. I learned how to hide my own panic so they would not feel like they were falling apart. And my relatives saw all of it. They just did not care until there was a house attached. The first thing my aunt said at the funeral home, even before the last set of flowers was delivered, was that the estate would need to be handled carefully because family homes always caused problems. That was funny to me because nobody had caused more problems than her. For years, she had treated my grandparents like a free storage unit and a backup bank account. She borrowed money from them and called it temporary. She left old furniture in the garage and called it keeping things in the family. Her oldest son had moved into my grandparents' basement for 4 months after losing a job and had somehow turned 4 months into 13, during which time he paid no rent and broke the laundry room door before leaving with my grandfather's ladder strapped to the roof of his car. Still, she talked like she was the guardian of family values. At the time, I was too tired to argue with any of them about old grievances. I just wanted to get through the funeral without collapsing in front of everyone. But the grief hit me in strange waves because I had already been grieving them while they were still alive. There is a particular kind of sadness that comes from watching the people who built your world slowly vanish while you are still standing in it. That was me. I was also not entirely prepared for how fast the vultures would circle once the obituary was printed. Within 2 days, my uncle was asking when he could come by to assess the value of the property. My cousin sent a text saying he hoped I would do the right thing and not let emotions cloud judgment. My aunt left 2 voicemails that were so polite they almost sounded threatening. They all kept using the same words: fair, family, legacy, as if those words meant anything after years of neglect. The weird part was that I almost started doubting myself. That is how good manipulative relatives are. They make you feel selfish for remembering what they did. They make you feel hysterical for insisting that the truth is the truth. I kept thinking maybe I was being oversensitive because the house was so emotional for everybody. Then I found the first real clue that this was not about nostalgia at all. It was about fear. I found it in my grandfather's desk drawer. While I was looking for the power of attorney papers the lawyer had mentioned, under an envelope of utility bills and old warranty cards was a handwritten list of numbers and dates. At first I thought it was a grocery list. Then I realized it was a record of cash withdrawals, not bank transfers. Cash, all made by my aunt over the last 18 months. Some were labeled for medicine, some were labeled for repairs, some had no explanation at all. My grandfather had underlined every single one. At the bottom of the page, he had written that he wanted everything reviewed before anyone tried to tell him what happened to his own money. My hands started shaking so hard, I had to set the page down. I knew my aunt had borrowed money before. I did not know she had taken enough that my grandfather had started quietly documenting her like evidence in a trial. The next thing I did was call the attorney whose name was on the estate folder. That call changed everything. The lawyer told me my grandparents had updated the will 8 months earlier. He also told me they had changed the deed to leave the house directly to me, while the rest of the estate was split among the relatives after debts and final expenses. There was no mystery about it. There was no loophole. There was no room for the story my aunt wanted to sell. The lawyer said both grandparents had been clear, sober, and stubbornly consistent when they made the changes. He also said something else that made me sit down again. He said my grandfather had asked for a second meeting after the first draft because he had concerns about how certain family members would behave once the funeral was over. That sentence sat in my chest like a stone. My grandfather had known, not only that the will would upset them, he had known they might try to come for the house. He had known I might need proof. He had planned for it. For a little while, that knowledge was comforting. Then it became terrifying. If he had expected trouble, that meant the trouble had been bigger than I thought. I started digging through every drawer, box, and file cabinet in the house. I was not trying to steal anything. I was trying to understand what my grandfather had been preparing for. In the back of a hall closet, taped behind a stack of Christmas ornaments, I found a small metal lockbox key. The box itself was hidden under old insurance papers in my grandmother's sewing room. Inside were more records. There were hospital receipts. There were home repair invoices. There were handwritten notes about phone calls with my uncle. There was also a bank envelope containing copies of 3 separate checks that had been written to my cousin over the previous 2 years. The memo line on each one said help with the truck. I knew my cousin had not had a truck in years. I stared at those checks so long that I almost missed the envelope underneath them. It was addressed in my grandfather's handwriting to me. It had not been mailed. It had been tucked away in the lockbox with everything else, as if he had wanted me to find it only after he was gone. Inside was a short note, not dramatic or emotional, just the kind of message he would have written if he knew he was running out of time. He said he had left the house to me because I had kept it alive. He said the others loved what the house represented more than the people who lived there. He said he was sorry I would have to fight for what should have been simple. He also told me to check the savings account if anyone started pretending they had no idea where the money had gone. That was the moment I stopped feeling sad and started feeling angry. Not loud angry, not dramatic angry, the kind of angry that makes you very calm. I went to the bank the next morning with his death certificate, the estate paperwork, and my own shaking hands. What I found there made my stomach drop. The savings account had not been drained, but it had been quietly nicked at over time. There were repeated withdrawals in amounts small enough to avoid attention and large enough to matter. Most of them lined up with the handwritten notes in my grandfather's drawer. A few were linked to charges for a storage unit I had never heard about. The bank clerk was polite in the distant way people are when they can tell your whole life is getting worse in front of them. She printed everything. I took it all to the lawyer. He asked me one question that I had not even thought to ask myself. He wanted to know whether my aunt had ever had access to their mail, phone, or online banking. I said yes to all 3. Then he got very quiet. That was when he told me he thought someone in the family had been setting up a narrative for a while. He said people do not usually go from normal disagreement to a deed challenge in 3 days unless they had already been rehearsing the accusation. That was when the pattern started making sense. My aunt had not been surprised by the will. She had been building toward resisting it. I suddenly remembered how often she had complained over the past year that my grandparents seemed confused and forgetful. I remembered her pushing me to leave them alone with a home aide she recommended. I remembered her insisting on taking them to a new lawyer when their old one retired. I remembered how irritated she had seemed when my grandfather refused to sign some paperwork she kept bringing over. At the time, I had assumed she was just being pushy. Now I wondered whether she had been trying to create a paper trail that supported a future challenge. The thought made me sick. I also realized something even worse. The family had not been calling me manipulative because they believed it. They had been saying it because it was the only defense they had. If they could make me sound greedy and isolated, then they could make my grandparents look incompetent. If they could make my grandparents look incompetent, then they could reopen everything. That explanation should have made me feel better. It did not. It made me feel like I was standing in the middle of a plan that had been in motion long before the funeral. The next week was the hardest stretch of my life up to that point. My aunt started calling my cousins together for what she called family discussions. My uncle posted vague comments online about respecting the wishes of the dead. A cousin I had not spoken to in years suddenly decided I needed to remember what family meant. People who had ignored my grandparents for years all developed a strong interest in boundaries once the house became part of the conversation. I stopped answering most of them. That only made them louder. My aunt sent me a copy of a petition her lawyer was preparing to file. She wanted the probate court to review the will on grounds of undue influence. The petition named me directly. It described me as the primary caregiver, which they tried to turn into evidence. It claimed I had isolated my grandparents from the family. It suggested I had taken advantage of their declining health. Reading it made my face burn because the parts that were true were being twisted into something ugly. Yes, I had been the primary caregiver. Yes, I was there most of the time. Yes, I helped them make decisions. That did not mean I controlled them. It meant I had done the work nobody else wanted to do. I brought the petition to the lawyer, expecting him to tell me to calm down. Instead, he smiled in the same tired way people do when they have seen this exact kind of mess before. He said undue influence cases usually fall apart when the records are good. Then he asked whether I had kept any notes during my grandmother's illness. I had kept everything: appointment dates, medication changes, house repairs, calls from doctors, changes in my grandfather's behavior after his grief got worse. It had all been survival at the time. Now it was evidence. I handed him every notebook I had. 2 days later, he called me and told me he had found something I needed to see. It was not in the will. It was in an attached memorandum my grandparents had signed with the estate paperwork. They had also left instructions for a separate letter to be opened after death if any family member challenged the home transfer. The letter was not long. It said they were fully aware of the strain the caregiving years had put on me. It said the house was both a gift and compensation. It said my aunt had already taken more than her share over the years. It said my grandparents had no interest in rewarding people who appeared only when assets were at stake. The letter was painfully simple. It was also the first time I cried in a way that felt clean, not because I was sad, because I finally felt seen. I thought that would be enough to stop them. I was wrong. The next escalation came from a place I did not expect. My cousin, the one with the truck and the vague online posts, showed up at the house while I was sorting old medical paperwork. He did not come inside. He stayed on the porch and spent 20 minutes trying to make me feel unstable without ever directly saying anything threatening. He kept insisting that the family was worried about me living alone in the house so soon after the funeral. He kept suggesting that grief could make people forget what they agreed to. He kept implying that maybe I had misunderstood what my grandparents meant. I knew then that the pressure campaign was not random. It was coordinated. Someone had told everyone to use concern as a weapon. After he left, I found cigarette ash by the side door. Nobody in my grandparents' household smoked. My cousin did. The next morning, I checked the back window and noticed it had been left unlocked. That had not happened in years. I called the police, not because I thought he had broken in, but because I suddenly understood how far they might be willing to go if they thought a little intimidation would make me cave. The officer who came by took a report and said it sounded like a family property dispute. He was not wrong. He was also not very helpful. I asked about trespass cameras, and that led me to the neighbor across the street. She had an old security system aimed at the driveway. When I asked whether she might have caught any of my relatives visiting after the funeral, she looked at me for a second and then said she had seen my aunt and uncle there twice, both times after dark. That was a new problem. I asked whether she had footage. She did. What she showed me made my skin go cold. The video was blurry, but it clearly showed my aunt unlocking the side gate with a key she had no business having. It also showed my uncle carrying out a box of papers and a framed folder from my grandfather's office. Not furniture, not keepsakes, documents. The timestamp was 2 nights after the funeral. I sat there in the neighbor's kitchen watching my own family steal from the house they had just accused me of manipulating. The worst part was how ordinary they looked doing it. No masks, no drama, just people acting entitled to whatever they could grab before anyone stopped them. I took the footage to the lawyer immediately. He told me to preserve everything and not tell the family yet. Then he asked me to think carefully about whether anything else might be missing. I went back through the house room by room, checking drawers, cabinets, and boxes. The filing cabinet in my grandfather's office had been opened. The top drawer had been rearranged. The old desk safe was still locked, but I noticed scratch marks around the keyhole, which meant someone had tried to force it recently. My hands started shaking again. I called the lawyer and told him about the safe. He told me to leave it untouched until he could arrange a locksmith with the estate authorization. That night I barely slept. I kept thinking about how my grandparents had spent their last months surrounded by people who wanted something from them. Money, signatures, property, access, approval. It suddenly felt obscene. The next day, the locksmith opened the safe. Inside was the final piece of the puzzle. There was a copy of the original will, a backup copy of the revised will, and a packet of bank statements bundled with a handwritten timeline from my grandfather. The timeline was devastating. It showed years of small withdrawals that matched my aunt's emergencies. It showed my cousin asking for loans that never got repaid. It showed my uncle taking money after a roof repair and then conveniently forgetting the debt. It showed my grandmother being pressured into letting the family use her credit card for what was described as a temporary hold on a vacation rental deposit, which turned into a full charge when the family trip got canceled. I had always suspected there had been some financial messes. I had not realized my grandparents had been quietly absorbing them without ever telling me the full extent. There was also something else in the safe that I was not prepared for. It was a folded copy of a home equity line application with my grandfather's signature. At first I thought I had misread it. Then I saw the rejection note stapled behind it. The application had been submitted by my aunt. The stated purpose was to fund accessibility updates for the house. The listed co-applicant was my uncle. The approval note was missing because the bank had denied it. My grandfather had circled the submission date in red pen and written that he never agreed to this. That was the first time I understood what the house fight was really about. They had not only wanted the house, they had wanted to use it as collateral. If the line of credit had gone through, they could have pulled cash from the property while my grandparents were still alive and claimed it was for their care. When it failed, they shifted to the next tactic, which was to wait for death and challenge the will. I felt physically ill reading that page. It meant their accusations against me were not just cruel. They were strategic. They needed my name off the house so they could keep chasing money through the property without me getting in the way. I showed everything to the lawyer. He finally stopped looking patient and started looking angry. He told me he wanted a full forensic review of the estate paperwork. He also told me to expect the family to get nastier once they realized I had proof. He was right. The real ugliness started the week. The probate filing became public. My aunt called every relative who would listen and told them I had hidden my grandparents from the family. My uncle told people I was brainwashing them while they were sick. A cousin I had once considered the least dramatic member of the family started forwarding me screenshots of their complaints, apparently hoping to stay neutral while still collecting gossip. One relative even suggested that, because I had lived with my grandparents, the arrangement itself was suspicious. That one made me stare at my phone for a long time. According to them, being there every day was proof of manipulation. Not being there every day somehow was not proof of abandonment. I stopped trying to make anyone understand. Instead, I started preparing for court. The lawyer advised me to make a complete list of every contribution I had made to the house and every expense I had covered. I spent 3 nights going through old receipts. I had paid part of the roof patch. I had replaced 2 broken appliances. I had covered utility bills during the winter my grandfather was hospitalized. I had bought groceries, medication trays, compression socks, and at least one absurdly expensive chair cushion that my grandmother swore made her back feel better. When I added it all up, it was more than I expected. Not enough to matter in a normal inheritance conversation. Enough to prove this had not been some free ride for me. I had been paying in work, time, and money for years. Then my lawyer asked me whether I would be willing to testify about my grandmother's mental state during the final year. That question scared me because the honest answer was complicated. She had good days and bad days. She forgot names sometimes. She repeated stories. She also had moments of brutal clarity where she could spot a lie from the other side of the room. I worried that any weakness in my memory would be used against me. The lawyer assured me the court would care more about patterns than perfection. That did not stop me from losing sleep. A week before the first hearing, my aunt tried one last move. She showed up alone this time, without the notary, and waited outside until I came out to get the mail. She had the same paper smile, but her face looked tired underneath it. She said the family would let me keep my bedroom furniture if I just signed the house over and stopped making a scene. That was the first time I understood how detached she had become from reality. She truly believed the house itself was the prize and that everything else could be bargained away. The furniture my grandmother picked out, the pictures on the wall, the dented tea kettle my grandfather had used for 20 years, the garden my grandmother tended until her knees gave out, the kitchen where I had spent half my adult life. To her, those were extras. To me, they were my life. I did not sign anything. I also did not yell. I just walked back inside and locked the door. The hearing was the first time I saw the full scale of their accusation in one place. They had paid for a handwriting consultant. They had hired a family friend to testify that my grandmother had seemed confused in the last few months. They had even brought in a distant relative who had not visited in years, and somehow expected the court to treat that as character evidence. My lawyer responded with bank records, video footage, estate documents, medical notes, and a timeline showing that the revised will had been prepared before my grandparents became fragile enough to exploit. But the strongest evidence was the simplest. The attorney who drafted the paperwork testified that my grandparents came in alone. He said they were clear about what they wanted. He said my grandfather was especially firm that the house belonged to the person who had kept the place running and kept them safe. He also said that when he asked whether the family might object, my grandmother had laughed in a way that made it obvious she knew exactly who he meant. That was the first time I saw my aunt lose color in her face. It was not enough to end things immediately. Probate fights almost never end in a single dramatic blow. They unravel, slowly, painfully, expensively. Still, that hearing changed the tone. The judge did not rule that day, but she ordered the house to remain in the estate framework exactly as written until every claim was reviewed. My aunt hated that. She started trying to negotiate privately after the hearing, sending messages through third parties and hinting that I could avoid a long court fight if I just shared the property value once the house sold. That was the part that made everything finally snap into focus for me. She did not care about keeping the house in the family. She cared about cashing it out. Once I saw that, I stopped feeling guilty. I also stopped being surprised by anything she did. The final revelation came from the storage unit. The lawyer had asked me to verify whether the unit in my grandfather's statements contained anything useful. I assumed it would be old Christmas decorations or furniture my grandparents had no room for. Instead, I found boxes of documents, old tax returns, and a binder labeled family loans. Inside was a full accounting of money my grandparents had loaned out over the years, complete with dates, amounts, and repayment promises that never happened. My aunt alone owed more than I made in a year. My uncle owed less, but only because my grandfather had quietly written off the rest after he lost his job and started drinking. My cousin owed the least and had still managed to turn a college tuition payment into a personal emergency fund. There was also a section labeled Why the House Matters. That section was the twist that rearranged everything in my head. My grandparents had planned for the house to come to me not only because I cared for them, but because they had already decided that the others had drained enough from the family. They saw the house as the one asset still anchored to actual work and actual memory. They wanted it protected from the people who treated inheritance like a prize for surviving. Other people, that could have felt vindictive. Instead, it felt painfully fair. By then, the family had already started turning on each other. My aunt blamed my uncle for pushing too hard. My uncle blamed my aunt for the home equity application. My cousin blamed both of them for not warning him that a challenge could backfire. The cousin who had posted the most online suddenly deleted everything and stopped answering calls. Apparently everyone loved the idea of contesting the will until they realized they might be the ones held responsible for the mess. The court eventually forced a full accounting, and that is where the real damage landed. The withdrawal records matched the bank statements. The storage unit rent had been paid from my grandparents' account for years. Several checks had been written to relatives for vague expenses that never got documented. The judge did not treat that as normal family chaos. She treated it as financial exploitation of an elderly couple. My aunt still tried to keep the narrative alive after that, but it collapsed under its own weight. The same relatives who had told me to be the bigger person suddenly wanted distance. The same people who had warned me not to ruin the family were now begging to be left out of the legal consequences. No one likes being associated with theft once the paperwork is laid out in front of them. The final ruling took months, but it was exactly what my grandparents wanted. The house remained mine. The challenge was denied. The no contest language in the will stripped my aunt, an uncle of the small inheritance they might have received once the debts were cleared. The judge also referred the financial records to the county investigator because of the pattern of withdrawals and the attempted property leverage. That part did not result in handcuffs, but it did result in something close enough to matter. They had to repay part of what they had taken through estate adjustments, and the family stopped inviting them to anything because everyone was suddenly very concerned about being next. For me, the aftermath was quieter than the fight. I had expected relief to feel bigger. Instead, it felt like exhaustion with better paperwork. I stayed in the house. I cleaned every room. I packed up my grandparents' belongings carefully, not because I was trying to preserve a museum, but because I could not bear to throw away the lives they had built here. I found my grandmother's old recipe cards in the kitchen drawer where she always kept them. I found my grandfather's ruler in the garage and remembered how he measured everything twice and still acted surprised when a shelf fit perfectly. I found little things too: a cracked mug, a burned spatula, a scarf I had not seen since high school. The house stopped feeling haunted and started feeling inhabited again. My aunt sent me one final message through a cousin, not apologizing exactly, but insisting she had only ever wanted what was best for the family. I did not respond. By then I understood that people who truly mean well do not spend weeks trying to force signatures out of the only person who cared for the dead. My uncle tried once to act like all of it had been a misunderstanding brought on by grief and stress. That might have worked on someone who had not watched him walk out of the house with my grandfather's paperwork after the funeral. My cousin eventually admitted, in the most indirect way possible, that he had known the challenge would happen before it did. That told me everything I needed to know about how much trust had survived, almost none of it. The part that still gets to me is how normal my grandparents were about all of this. They were not bitter old people hunched over a grudge. They were tired. They were observant. They were practical. They saw exactly who showed up for them and who only showed up for the assets. They made their choice with their eyes open. That was the final truth my relatives could not stand. They were not cheated. They were judged. And they lost. A year later, I planted my grandmother's hydrangeas back by the porch. The first summer after the court case, they bloomed hard and uneven, the way old plants do when they are trying to come back from neglect. I sat on the steps and thought about how close I had come to signing that deed just to make everyone stop looking at me like I was a thief. If I had done it, the house would have been sold within months, the debts would have been buried, and my grandparents' last act of care would have been erased by the same people who had spent years taking from them. Instead, the home stayed where it belonged. Not because I fought beautifully, because I refused to hand over proof that my grandparents had the right to decide what happened to what they built. That seems obvious now. It did not feel obvious when I was standing in the hallway with a notary, shaking so hard I could barely hold a pen. I still think about that moment whenever someone tells me family is family. Sometimes family is just the first group of people who decide they are entitled to whatever you are carrying. My grandparents knew that. They planned around it. And in the end, that was the only reason I still have the house at all.